6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to History with Jackson, the home of accessible and digestible history. I'm your host, Jackson, and in today's episode, I'm talking to historian Max Portman all about West Ham United and its historic interactions and links with its communities. Now, Max is a fantastic historian and a fantastic sports historian, so you're in for a real treat today. If you're a West Ham fan, I know you're going to love it. And if you're not a West Ham fan, it will really make you think about how your club or your club in a different sport has interacted with its communities throughout history. Now, it's a really fascinating episode. I know you're going to love it. But before we jump into that and we'll leave you with Max, do please consider heading to the History of Jackson website to check out the new blog. We have historians from across the world, from different backgrounds, writing about their different specialisms and their research. I know you're going to love reading that and learning from that. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you with the capable hands of Max. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we are talking to historian Max Portman about his work into West Ham United and its local community. Now, Max is a good friend of mine. We've been doing some great work together in various capacities across the past year. I'm excited to show and share Max's research with you all. So how are you doing, Max?
I'm doing good, thank you, Jackson. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well, thanks, mate. I'm excited to talk about, even though I'm not a West Ham fan, I'm excited to talk about football and history and how they intersect, because it's always great to talk about sport.
Oh, definitely, 100%. It's one of those things, I think it's along with science, that can just unite us all. It covers the global idiom of a lot of things. And it's one of those things when you say to someone, I'm doing a PhD on football, everyone's like, oh, really? It's one of these things that really captures the imagination from the off. So I'm very glad that, I've been invited here today. Thank you for having me on. And I'm really glad that we get to talk about football, outside of me and you just being friends away from the podcast world.
No, it definitely does unite us. And one thing about West Ham that I think we're all united on is Ward-Prowse should be called up for the England squad. But that's another conversation, another podcast. But first question I have for you that I ask all our guests here at the History Jackson podcast was, what was the inspiration behind this research?
Well, I'd have to say I've always liked football. Since I was a kid, always really enjoyed football. And then when I got to university, there was a point where you have to write your undergraduate dissertation. And I thought to myself, could I write about football? And then I thought to myself, yeah, why not? So I put the proposal forward and it took, and I wrote my undergrad proposal and did it fine. And then I got to my master's and I was a bit like, could I do it again? And then one of my lecturers at the time, a man by the name of Professor Ross Wilson, said to me, here's something called sports history. I'm like, sports history? This is fantastic. So naturally, it's just been a evolution, really, of kind of discovering that there's this great little niche in academia of sports history and kind of running with it and evolving and developing it probably since 2016, 2017. And then kind of when we got to my PhD, we kind of realised that I wanted to do something called All of London, and was then told by my then supervisor, Dr. Dion Georgiou, very much along the lines of, well, you can only pick one club. And as you've pointed out, there's only one club for me, and that's West Ham United.
I think it's always nice to see historians taking their personal life and their personal experiences into their research, because I think it makes our research more personable and more accessible, which I always quite like. But you made a great point there about sports history kind of developing recently. How has that field developed?
Well, sports history really has its origin in the 70s. So very much when social history starts appearing after the postmodern boom in the late 60s. Football then becomes this kind of thing that people pick up on because it's the most popular sport in this country. So initially you get sociologists who pick up on it, like Eric Dunning and John Murphy and Patrick Williams. And then you kind of, then James Worthing picked up on it in a historical sense, and he releases a book in 1975 called The People's Game. And that then kickstarts this whole thing that kind of progresses from there on. So in the beginning of the 80s, you've got a lot of people who talk about football and commerce, so the likes of Stephen Tischler and Ray Vamplew, and then that evolves in the 90s into more historical focuses on class. Since the noughties, we've had this progression of women's football coming into it with the likes of Jean Williams and Fiona Skillen. And now we're at this great point, 50 years on, really, from the beginnings of it in 1975, of having such a wide spectrum. I've seen people talk about football in the global south, and I've seen people talk about football clubs, and I've seen people talk about football commerce. And I think, there's a real appetite for it, both in the academic sense and in the public sphere, with the likes of Kieran Maguire, who teaches up at in Liverpool, who does a lot of great work on football finance, and who most people listen to this podcast definitely would have heard of.
It's nice that this field is starting to get its moment in the spotlight, because it definitely needs that time and needs that space for people to learn about football outside of the big names, Mbappe, Ronaldo, Messi, wherever you fall on that debate. But it's nice to see that clubs and small clubs are getting their moment. I mean, even in front of me, I've got the brilliant book by Jonathan Wilson on Behind the Curtain, on Cold War football behind the Iron Curtain. So it's nice to see these books and these clubs getting their space. But how are football clubs, communities, imagined or tangible communities, and themes of identity linked?
That's the $1 million question, really, isn't it? Well, it depends on who you ask, really, because some people will say it's linked by class, some people will say it's linked by area, some people will say it's linked by us as people. And I think the overarching thing is that it's just the cause in which we can all unite behind, and it then creates this imagined community, as it were, and becomes something tangible as a result. So you've got this idea that West Ham United is based in East London, and probably up until the 60s or 70s, you've got this heavy industry in East London where it's very much a lot of men work in either the docks or Ford in Dagenham, or the heavy industry is just in the area. And then in the 70s, it just collapses. And all these people move away to the new towns of Chelmsford, Basildon, Stevenage, Hemel Hempstead. But yet, you've got this thing still in the East End that brings them all back all the time. And exactly, in your head, you think, well, that's just imagined, there's just this community that just goes to football on the weekend. But no, it's tangible, because you've got this really great thing that brings people back, gives them that belonging that they had once upon a time when they lived in the area, and reminds them of the area.
What you're saying there really comes at the heart of some of those modern debates of support your local, because you have those communities where it's very much kind of one of those academic things kind of brought into the public sphere of why do you support certain clubs and why are you part of these communities. But I want to ask on that particular theme, what is West Ham United then, and what does it stand for?
This is a great question, because it's a real topic of debate, not just amongst other people in the area, but amongst us as supporters ourselves. And I'm sure for those who follow football, they've heard of the mythologized West Ham way. So some people believe it's good football, played well, and tried with effort. That's what some people believe West Ham United is in the West Ham way. Other people, if you're talking about the West Ham way, as it were, or this idea of what West Ham United stands for, it's just a club who just want to give back to people, really, as best as they can. And there's this great thing in Charles Caw's book, who wrote a book in the 80s, great read for anybody of any football sports, any club, just read it, because it's a great understanding of the football club as an institution, as well as a social pillar of the community. And there's this great idea that, if you look after them, they will look after you. So if you make a good stadium like we had at the Bowling Ground, the fans will come, support every week, even if the team are not doing well, and they'll love you. And if you show you love them, maybe not to the extent that they love you, it pays. in the long run. I mean, if you look at Arsenal at the moment, the club you support, is that they've made this effort now to show the supporters they care, especially after the whole Super League thing and all that. And Mikel Arteta does this great push of making sure that the fans are part of the experience as well as the team are. And I think that really pays dividends. And I think that's what West Ham stands for. It's a club who are a family, really. And they're a family who look after each other and support each other through thick and thin.
I think that's a brilliant interpretation, because I definitely, you brought Arsenal into the conversation, so I'm sitting voluntarily up now. I think it's something that I certainly agree with. I think it's something I certainly agree with. Having gone through the dire days of Unai Emery, where you didn't have that connection to the club, you had a lot of the players felt like mercenaries, and there wasn't a lot of connection. But having now Mikel Arteta, a player who was at the club as a player, who understands the club, you do feel that connection a bit more. And having just signed a West Ham player, sorry about it, with Declan Rice, it's nice to have a player come to the club who gets it, who gets that connection between the club and the fans, having experienced it at West Ham, and he's taking exactly the same way back across to our club.
I totally agree. And do you know what? There's a lot of West Ham fans out there who will probably dislike me for saying this, but I 100% agree. I think Declan really understood what it was to be a West Ham fan, and really understood what it was to be a part of West Ham. And I think, obviously, a lot of that helps being the understudy to Mark Noble for many years, who is born, bred, and, lives West Ham in a lot of ways, especially now as our sporting director. But I think that's something that all these clubs who have been successful and really stand for areas encapsulate. I mean, if you look at Manchester United with the class of 92, they got it. They really got it. And Alex Ferguson really instilled it into his players that, this club isn't just for you, it's for them. And I think that's what Declan Rice kind of personifies now with you at Arsenal. It's not for Arsenal, it's for the Arsenal supporters.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful, couple of case study there from history of the class of 92. But we are digressing a little bit. But it gives us a good segue into my next question, which was, how has West Ham as a club and its community kind of developed since the 80s, and why is West Ham in particular a useful case study in studying a club and its community?
Well, you've got to look at it this way, is that since the 1980s, East London and West Ham kind of personify what's happened in this country in a social sense. It's this great idea that football is a mirror to society. What happens in football happens in society and vice versa. So if you look at West Ham and East London since the 80s, you've got this community that's been decimated in the post-industrial world, and now it's being rebuilt in this regentrified idea of commerce through Canary Wharf, and the news outlets are all moving over there. And yet you've got this plucky little football club who's always looked as the poor neighbour to the likes of Arsenal, Tottenham and Chelsea. And that it's now kind of playing catch up with them and becoming a football business like all football clubs have become. They're not football clubs anymore in the sense of a club. They're businesses. They look at the bottom line of how much money are they going to get in? Who can we sign to make our teams better? How much money can we spend to better ourselves? And I think West Ham have really been caught up in that in a lot of ways. I think if you look at the 90s under Harry Redknapp, he signed more, I think it was 134 players in 7 years to try and better the football club. And he spent 100 and something million. I think it might have been 134 million, which is ironic, kind of thinking how many players he signed. Million a player, really. And then you look at this idea of since the current ownership are in charge with David Gold, God rest his soul, Karen Brady and David Sullivan, that very much there's this push to being a complete and utter commercial business. How can West Ham, the brand, get out to the world? And that's why you've got London written on the bottom of the badge. And it's just this idea that while East London's been pushing towards this huge commercial push, West Ham United's also doing this big commercial push. And it definitely alienates some people, just as it's alienated East Londoners, who have grown up in the area and now don't recognise the area they come from anymore. I think that's why West Ham's useful, because East London is kind of the petri dish of what's happening across the country, and has been happening across the country since the 1980s.
I think that's some really nice points there about. I particularly like the point about football being a mirror to British society. You know, we've just on this podcast we've had Chris Burkett just come in and discuss with us about how baseball is a mirror to American society, and it's interesting to see similar parallels playing out here in the UK. But also within this development and push, and we were discussing this just before we came on, the role of the women's game. Can you just give us a brief kind of outlook on how the women's game has developed in England, but then kind of detail how that's worked with West Ham?
Well, if we're looking at the history of women's football probably has its height, its first initial height, in the beginning of the 20th century. You know, it's slowly growing in the backdrop of the late 19th, early 20th century. There's a great game, I believe, at Crouch End in 1890 something, and I think it might be 1895, and I think there's almost 100,000 people who attend that, and it goes through this huge push through until the First World War, when all the men go to war, and naturally who's left at home on the home front? The women, who take on the mantle of playing football, and you get the likes of Dick Kerr ladies, who become this huge, unstoppable football team. And I think just after the war, where women are now raising money to make sure there's funds there for heroes who are coming back from the war, it irritates men. It irritates the men, you know. How dare these women come along and do it better than us, almost. It upsets the FA, who very much are middle-class aristocratic men, and do not like the fact that the women are almost stepping on their toes. So that's where the 1921 ban comes into place, because women are not just, you know, trying to raise money for the troops who have come back from the war, but they're also raising money for anti-establishment funds, which is somewhat hasn't been proven, but it would add to this idea and add to the, you know, the cause for exclusion from the game for 1921. And then this ban carries on till 1971, which is where this modern women's football begins. And this has been growing for the last 50 years through a very slow progression in the 70s and 80s through to the inception of the league in 1991, which then gets built upon, and then the professionalisation of the game truly begins from 2012 with the introduction of the WSL, and has gone fully professional in 2018. So really now you're at this idea of women's football being very at its pivotal moment now, with the introduction of the NUCO, as shown in the Carney review earlier this summer. And you've got this really big push now for women's football, and that, you know, investors are looking at it as you can invest in it at a fraction of the men's game, and you could be at the forefront of something that could be socially a huge, huge tool for betterment.
So within this with very detailed history of the women's game that you just mentioned there, you've mentioned a couple of points that I find really interesting. I want to kind of expand upon even more, really, is there seems to be a theme of exclusion, inclusion and marginalisation within this history of women's football. And I know women's football is at this moment where we're starting to gain the ascendancy over the Americas. But how has West Ham itself played a role in this exclusion and marginalisation?
Before the First World War and during the full 1921 ban, there isn't much of an affiliation between women's football and West Ham. I mean, people like Steve Bolton are doing great work with the Dagenham Invincies, where they're looking at East London football. And there is a history of women's football in East London, but West Ham have no real link to it. It kind of appears the first time there's any West Ham's team is in the 1970s under John Greenacre. And that disappears in the mid-80s and then reignites again in what is its modern form as the West Ham Women in 1992. So very much West Ham Women have kind of started the exclusion really when women's football is actually pushing for progression, and it's bizarre. So in 2015, you have the Hunts, who were the chairman at the time, coming under fire from the women's team and being accused, and the club, the men's club for that matter, of, making sure there wasn't enough investment in them. They were training by the side of a road, and there was this real thing. And the club captain and 5 other players walked out because of this. And the club were accused of not caring, and it is part of the absorption of the women's team into the main club, which is led to believe in 2016. But very much this exclusion carries on, even up till last year, where, Alex Scott, I don't know if many people remember this, is after England won the Euros, she said, all those years ago in 2018 when we were pushing for this, people didn't want to have us at our grounds, and West Ham United were one of these clubs that didn't want to have the women's football at its ground. You've got the 60,000 seat stadium in London, and yet you're not having the women's Euros. It's a huge tournament. Why would you turn that down? I think that's what I can't fathom as a football supporter more than anything. And, you've got this great stadium in East London that, has this huge history as being the Olympic Stadium, and yet you don't have women's football there? What? The mind boggles.
It definitely, as you said, with football being a mirror for British society, it's very interesting to see how a big institution during a moment of social upheaval and social inclusion has taken the steps to not include until the point where they've had to. And it's very interesting to see that playing out at an institution such as West Ham. But that brings us on to another member, another group which is a member of the West Ham community, which have experienced different kind of treatment. How has West Ham worked to include or exclude members of its LGBTQIA plus community?
Well, West Ham United are actually very good on this. We've got Pride of Irons, who are our official supporters group, who deal with the LGBTQIA plus community. And there's always a lot of inclusion. The club are very much at the forefront of Football First homophobia. They'll always be very much at the forefront. And they have been, I think they've been given the gold medal for inclusivity in footballing terms. I don't know how this works. That's not my area of expertise, but the club have made sure they're a very inclusive club and a very inclusive institution going forward. But the majority of the club's output is through Pride of Irons, and they do very good work. And to be fair for West Ham, they have in the past, like all football clubs, been ignorant of the community. But now the community is, as you said, we're in this moment of social upheaval with a lot of these issues. And, these issues are becoming more aware, and we're becoming more understanding of these issues for communities that maybe me or you don't have the lived experience of. But, West Ham are trying to do their best, I think, in that respect. And you can't fault them for that.
It's interesting to see how a club within a field which has traditionally not been very inclusive and not been particularly accepting is working to try and demonstrate that it is accepting and it is inclusive. But you mentioned within a few of your answers there a landmark moment in West Ham's history where they moved from the Boleyn Grant to the Olympic Stadium, which is now, I think, the Queen Elizabeth II Stadium. How has
the London Stadium,
the London Stadium, even, how is the way that West Ham has historically interacted with its local community, the businesses in that community, changed with this moment in its history?
I'm glad you asked me this, because I did a talk on this at UCL last year, and I mentioned this. After the club left the bowling ground in 2016, there was a lot of businesses in the area who relied on the matchday income, obviously, and all par 2 of them have shut down in 7 years. So if you count on your fingers how many businesses I'm about to mention, the 2 that are still standing are the bowling pub, which shut down before COVID, and now is reopened with new landlords, and Urcan's, which is a fish and chip restaurant on the Barking Road. You've lost a pie and mash restaurant. You've lost the sweet stalls outside. You've lost, this is one for the West Ham fans, the Rib Man. who essentially sells very great ribs with very hot sauces, if that's your kind of thing. And you've lost stalls, you've lost calves, and you must have lost a dozen businesses, really, in the space of 7 years. And yet, you've got these two businesses who, fair play to them, are still plucking along and still trying to do it, but they haven't got the income that football used to bring in. And yet there was no support from the club, who at the time says, of course we'll support you. We'll bring you along. We'll do this. We'll do that. We'll make sure permits are in place. Nothing. And I think if we go back to my earlier answer about this commercial business, I think that's where West Ham have gone wrong in recent years. And this whole idea that I've been talking about West Ham being a family, you know, we've got to this point as a family now where we're maybe not looking after certain members of that family but as well as we should do. I think that's the problem now with these businesses. You know, we're intricately linked with the community. All football clubs are. And the fact that we're kind of almost turning our back on the community that supported us for over 100 years, that's wrong. Morally, ethically, whatever way you look at it, it's wrong.
And it's interesting to see how there's an ignorance of history within that. There's a changing, there's a moment in history that's happening at that as well. And it's interesting to see that play out. Now you're also part, and so am I actually. I don't know why I'm saying isolating you. We're also part of an organisation, a society where quite a few of us are doing very similar work, looking at these moments and discussing them. And that society is the British Society of Sports Historians. Could you tell us, tell listeners about this society and what we do at the BSSH?
Well, the BSSH have been going since the 80s, and we are what we say on the tin, which are sports historians. But we're not just solely sports historians. We deal in sports management, sports leisure. We deal with all facets of sport. And we are very much in the British Society of Sports Historians looking at the future. And we realise that we live in a multicultural society. And we realise that, you know, every historian, as you said earlier, has his own story. It comes from our personal backgrounds. And naturally, we're trying to make sure that we champion the right issues, and we make sure that we're trying to bring on sport and show people how good sport it can be as a betterment and a betterment tool in this country.
And it really is a great organisation, society to be part of, and to see the different work the other members are doing. You're also the membership secretary as well. Is there any upcoming projects for the BSSH that you want to mention? You want people to know about?
Yes, I do actually. Next summer, at the University of Chichester, who I'm affiliated with, and I'm planning this conference, is our annual conference we host every August or September, and details will be published around February, March time of next year. So if you are interested in coming, please sign up to the BSSH. I'll help you, obviously, being membership secretary, and we look forward to seeing you in Chichester next summer, where me and Jackson will both be.
I mean, I'm really looking forward to going back to Chichester and being involved with the BSSH at this conference. It's going to be a great weekend.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to bringing the BSSH down to Chichester for the first time.
Now, obviously, Max, people are going to want to interact with you online, interact with your work. Where can they go?
If you want, mostly you'll find me on X, which is formerly Twitter, at WHU Historian. And in there you can find the links to my LinkedIn, my own personal website, The Hammett Historian, where recently I published a blog series for Black History Month, as well as my Threads account and all other social media accounts.
And I thoroughly recommend going and checking out Max's social media and his blog, because it's a really great piece of content. I know you're going to love reading it, regardless if you're a West Ham supporter or not. I mean, I'm not one, and I love reading it. So thank you very much for coming on, Max. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for listening to this episode with Max Portman, where he has discussed his research into West Ham United and its historic links and interactions with its communities. Now, if you enjoyed this episode or any of the other episodes that we create here at History of Jackson, please do consider heading to the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below, or heading to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts. Now, next week, we have another great episode lined up, and that is our Christmas special episode. So I know you don't want to miss that. Now, I will talk to you all next week.